Hello, everybody. I'm Hemalata Iyer, Conference Co-Chair. It is my privilege to welcome and introduce Professor Archie Dick. He's from the Department of Information Science, University of Pretoria, South Africa. Professor Archie Dick is an emeritus professor and a former head of the Department of Information Science and the chairperson of the School of Information Science and Technology. He previously taught at the University of Western Cape and the University of South Africa. And he is visiting professor. He has held many international positions that include visiting professor at the Wayne University in Detroit, the endowment and visiting professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, an honorary research fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Center for History of Print and Digital Culture. He's a participant in the Thai Royal Golden Jubilee PhD program under the Thailand Research Fund 2017 to 2019. Professor Archie served as the deputy chairperson of the IFLA's Committee on Freedom of Access to Information and Freedom of Expression, 2006 to 2007. And in the past, chairman of the National Council of Library and Information Services, NCLIS, in South Africa. The Cambridge University Press published his recent book, Reading Spaces in South Africa, 1850 to 1920s. The title of his talk today is Information Heroes from the Old and the New in South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Professor Archie Dick. Over to Archie.
Thank you very much, Hema. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Good. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to, it's afternoon here in Pretoria, in South Africa. It's a pleasure for me to participate and make a presentation at this conference. So as Hema has mentioned, I'm going to be talking about information heroes from the old to the new in South Africa. A few months ago, Jacobus de Toy, a physically disabled gentleman, came looking for me at the University of Pretoria. He had read an article that I wrote several years ago. I had critiqued South Africa's Promotion of Access to Information Act and argued that power is information. Jacobus told me how an insurance company had abused that law, as well as the Protection of Personal Information Act to defraud him, and how the lawyers that he had hired to represent him had failed in 4 separate claims. Now, representing himself, he has turned to one of the country's high courts for relief in an ongoing legal battle. He intends to write and tell his own story, as he says, and I quote, to increase the quantity of smart decisions that ordinary people make on the basis of facts obtained from information that was mined from data, end of quote. Our subsequent exchange of emails motivated me to find and analyze more stories of how, across our country's troubled history, ordinary South Africans like Jacobus have confronted powerful institutions to access and then share information for the benefit of other ordinary South Africans. For their persistence in extremely difficult circumstances, I consider them to be among this country's information heroes. My paper introduces 3 such information heroes across South African history. First, Johannes Smisson, a Cape slave who used Tamil language medical information to cure and save the lives of his 6 slave lodge companions in the first Dutch colonial period. That's from 1652 to 1795. Second, Patrick Millet, a printer who was also a political activist in the so-called Information for Liberation campaign during the apartheid period, which was from 1948 to 1994. And third, Athol Williams, a whistleblower who recently revealed large-scale corruption in some of the new South Africa's public institutions. Their stories embody an ongoing struggle for information freedom in this country. And their stories connect information histories with information geographies. By that, I mean that the shift from pre-modern to modern understandings of information was not the same everywhere, and that time and place matter in information science theories and research. So let me start with Johannes Smithson. In the first period of Dutch colonialism, a slave lodge built in the port city of Cape Town in 1679 housed the Dutch East India Company slaves brought from trading ports in Southeast Asia. The 1714 slave lodge census lists 17-year-old Johannes Smithson as a third-generation Creole half-caste. His Dutch father, a second medical master, had returned to Amsterdam. His slave mother became the matron in charge of the slave lodge school for girls and women. Johannes became the teacher for the boys, and in a remarkable notebook that this slave kept, he introduces himself as writing and reading master in service of the Honorable East Indian Company, which was a Dutch multinational company. The notebook includes family-related information, letter types for writing and reading, examples of arithmetic, and a morning hymn. Copied across 2 pages and in a different handwriting, there is also an intriguing list of medical remedies written in the Tamil language. These were very likely traditional family remedies that represented the Siddha tradition, a South Indian variant of Vedic medicine. This list confirms Johannes's other identity as a healer or doctor in the slave lodge. It is not unlikely that he also taught his young students about hygiene and how to remain healthy in the dire conditions that they found themselves. In 1713, when he was just 16, more than half of the slave lodge's population died as a result of a smallpox epidemic at the Cape. That may have triggered his search for medical information. The Tamil list in his notebook includes remedies with active ingredients to cure common ailments in the unsanitary conditions of captivity, such as fever, indigestion, coughs, and tooth infection. We do not fully understand how the information about the active ingredients listed in these remedies was used or adapted to local conditions, nor how indigenous substitutes were applied. The slave lodge also served company soldiers and sailors as a brothel for 1 hour every night, which may explain why there are 3 remedies for venereal diseases in Johannes's notebook. This information was crucial for the lodge women slaves, and one remedy required Acacia nilotica, a species of acacia or thorn-mimosa tree native to both Africa and the Indian subcontinent. In that way, Johannes developed an alternative medical information system in the slave lodge. He substituted local active ingredients for those listed in the Tamil remedies copied into his notebook. His system connected to with the wider information networks of Dutch, Portuguese, and other trading companies whose ships called at the early Cape Seaport harbor. Indigenous communities and slaves exploited visits by the many ships traveling to the east, as well as their return voyages. Maritime researchers at Leiden University calculated that between 1600 and 1652, there were 1,327 ships from England, Portugal, France, and Denmark that traveled via the Cape to Asia. Slaves and free blacks, that included manumitted slaves, were among those that bartered with the ship's crew and passengers in unexpected ways. They accessed formal and informal information networks, using their literacy skills to exchange, evaluate, and act on information. One site of this rich repository of shared information was the company garden in front of the slave lodge, cultivated by over 50 male and female slaves from different countries. Also called an African mother garden by a visitor, it had sections for vegetables and fruit trees, and there were medicinal plants and trees with special sections for Indian trees. We can safely conclude that many of the ingredients for the medical cures were available in the lodge garden, but the slave lodge was a demographic sinkhole with a constant mortality that Johannes witnessed, sometimes daily. Staying alive and healthy until manumission or liberation was both a priority and a challenge for slaves. Reliable and curative medical information was therefore life-saving and reassuring. Johannes's indigenous and exogenous medical information system sustained his and his fellow slaves' journeys to freedom at the Cape. Now move on to my second information hero, Patrick Millet, the anti-apartheid printer. It is quite remarkable that in the South African apartheid period, which was from 1948 to 1994, access to information and information freedom themes also characterized the life and work of a distant relative of Johannes Smith. It was only in the so-called New South Africa that Patrick Millet, a political activist and an African National Congress printer in South Africa's liberation struggle, discovered family connections with Johannes on his mother's side. Patrick grew up in Cape Town's working class districts, not far from the slave lodge. There are several parallels with this slave ancestor. He was placed in foster care for just over 3 years and saw his mother only once every 2 months. He then attended a residential industrial trade school and commenced work in a factory when he was 15. In the same way that Johannes's slave masters had assigned him a Creole and half-caste identity in the slave lodge, the apartheid government racially classified Patrick as other colored when he applied for an identity document as a 16-year-old. He rejected this classification, just as he had earlier rejected classification as white, that the official completing his application insisted on based on what he looked like. Patrick would later explain about identity and heritage that, and I quote, "People need information. and the fractured approach to looking at sub-identity as South Africans does not help anyone, end of quote. The lie about his identity and the deception by the apartheid government and subsequently by the African National Government drove his lifelong search for information and for truth. Based on his fair complexion and a letter from his mother to the South African Defence Force about him keeping bad company and needing discipline, Patrick was drafted against his will into compulsory military service. He resisted fiercely, and for this defiance, he was severely beaten and humiliated. After release from the military in the mid-1970s, he trained as a maintenance fitter at a printing company. The degrading experience in the racist apartheid army inspired him to establish a secret African National Congress cell in Cape Town. He produced and edited an underground anti-apartheid newspaper called Young Voice. And when it was banned, he republished it as New Voice. But the government banned that as well. By then, Patrick had joined Umkhonto weSizwe, which means Spear of the Nation, and it was the military wing of the African National Congress. In 1978, he and his family went into exile in neighboring Botswana, where he trained with an African National ally, Congress ally, the South African Communist Party. Determined to engage in the information struggle against apartheid, he completed a 3-year course in lithographic printing. With this printing and editing experience and further technical training, he became involved in the broadcasting, printing, and publishing sectors of the African National Congress's Department of Information and Publicity. It was already active as a liberation press in the early 1970s. Together with the African National Congress's Radio Freedom, where he also worked, they contradicted the propaganda of the apartheid government's own Department of Information. To improve his skills in a campaign that would expose the government's disinformation schemes, Patrick studied and graduated from the London College of Printing. From 1985 to 1990, he worked full-time for the African National Congress's Department of Information and Publicity Press, and served on the editorial boards of journals committed to contradicting apartheid propaganda. The press circulated information both in South Africa's underground information system and internationally. It became a champion for information freedom and saw itself as a strategic center in the liberation of all oppressed South Africans. But disillusioned in the new South Africa by the African National Congress's same disparaging and apartheid approach in separating out and labeling people as colored, Patrick launched what may be called a new information struggle for what he calls restorative memory. He now firmly maintains that restorative memory informs projects that can bring restorative justice, reparation, and restitution. Acting on discussions with an exile colleague, Reginald September, and the seminal ideas of political activist Neville Alexander, both now deceased anti-apartheid stalwarts, Patrick spearheaded a group of heritage activists that founded the Kamissa Museum and Center for Restorative Memory. Located in the iconic Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, it officially opened to the public in April 2021. This museum affords physical access and open source information. It takes its name from the river Kamissa, or place of sweet waters, which was what the indigenous Khoi peoples named Cape Town. This name symbolizes several rivers, including the Kamissa River, as well as 36 springs of Table Mountain, all of which were channeled underground and drained into the ocean as the city grew. The museum symbolizes the heritage tributaries of the Cape's peoples, brought together in different ways and from many roots or origins. A Kamissa museum online is now publicly accessible on the internet too, as a teaching and learning resource, and it includes the story of Patrick's distant relative, Johannes Smithson. Patrick argues that agency is a feature of living documents to produce certain effects, and that Smithson's notebook could play a restorative memory role in the online museum. It is, in fact, the agency quality of information in the notebook as a living document that should be enriched to visualize the large school to bring about restorative memory. A film clip produced by the late slave historian Robert Shaw attempts to capture the early 18th century lodge classroom atmosphere. The music and scenes with water paintings of learners with educational tools and their caring teacher help to achieve and restore memory. The clip imagines one of Johannes's lessons and recovers memories of and information of hope in captivity. It dramatizes some of the notebook's texts that could play both a restorative memory and a restorative justice role to repair harm committed against victims and their community, and to include consideration of the perpetrators. South Africans are familiar with restorative justice, which characterized the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that investigated human rights violations by the apartheid regime. Patrick hopes that the online museum's enriched information will challenge what he labels as, and I quote, ethno-nationalism, singular ethnicities, tribalism, and notions of race or ethnic purity. This film clip should be added to the online museum's envisaged high-tech IT memory well. Its aim is for visitors to draw from the well, or in other words, retrieve its information formatted as text narratives, photographs, the spoken word, imagery, music, poetry, and video clips projected onto a large overhead screen. I move now to my final information hero. One of this online museum's editorial consultants and financial supporters is Athol Williams. He explains that the more I know my ancestors, the more I know myself. He got to know even more about himself when he uncovered the corrupt strategies of his employer, the global management consultancy firm, Bain & Company, and he learned more about the importance of information for restorative memory and for restorative justice. In October 2019, in the New South Africa, he informed on, or blew the whistle, on Bain & Company. Athol has qualifications in engineering, management, and politics, and is an award-winning poet. He co-founded the non-government organization Read to Rise that promotes literacy in the Western Cape's working class townships. Bain & Company had contracted Athol to help mend relations with the South African government after a commission of inquiry into tax administration and governance found in 2018 that it had been involved in state capture. State capture is a type of systemic political corruption in which private interests significantly influence a state's decision-making process to their own advantage. The presiding judge described the relationship between the company and the commissioner of SARS, who is the South African Revenue Service, as deep collusion to damage the tax collection authority. The result was the failure of several government departments to effectively deliver essential law enforcement, security, transport, electricity, and information services to South Africans. Drawing on this experience, Athol elaborates that full-on state capture occurs when corporations influence governmental processes and political actors allow them to do so for private gain. It falls somewhere between corrupted states, where elected officials still remain in control of all facets of government and governance, and a coup, where illegitimate parties control all functions and misappropriate the state's finances at will. Athol had worked for Bain before, and he believed that his good standing with that company was the reason why he had been selected for this task. He understood his new involvement not as defending Bain and Company, but as acting in the interests of South Africa to bring remedy for harms that it had caused. By 2009, South Africa was experiencing a takeover by corrupt politicians and officials that Bain and Company began to exploit. This occurred through a collaborative effort to repurpose some of South Africa's public institutions and redirect public resources. The key institution affected was the South African Revenue Service, which led to a tax collection shortfall estimated at 100 billion rand. The overall cost of state capture, according to the country's president, is between 500 billion rand and 1 trillion rand. Frustrated by his efforts with Bain and Company and its legal team, Baker McKenzie, to obtain relevant information from official reports and documents, Athol reported the company in October 29 to the Zondo Commission, which was arranged by the South African government, and he was reported to this commission for withholding information about its complicity in state capture. The Zondo Commission was a judicial commission of inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector, including organs of state. Athol had insisted on seeing Bain and Company's final report so that he could fulfill the task it had assigned to him. Without that information, he could not in good conscience report to the Commission and to South Africans that the company had made amends for damaging not just SARS, but other public institutions in the country as well. In fact, Athol concluded that Bain and Company had never intended to make a full disclosure. And the reason was that it feared a more comprehensive investigation and possible prosecution by the United States Department of Justice. The Zondo Commission concluded subsequently that the South African branch of Bain and Company had colluded with the former president of South Africa and with its revenue service, chief executive officer, to capture the tax agency. In that way, SARS, or the South African Revenue Service, and other public institutions were damaged as public funds were siphoned off into private pockets. Athol's connections with Bain and Company is a dark and unfinished chapter in South Africa's information history. For its criminal dealings, the South African government and the United Kingdom government banned Bain and Company for 10 years in August 2022. But the United Kingdom government had already lifted this ban by March 2023, after the company had admitted that it had made mistakes, but that its motives had never been intentional. Of greater concern is that, like other brave South African whistleblowers, Athol Williams is now in hiding and without income or guarantees for his safety. He was deeply disappointed that the President of South Africa made no mention of protection for whistleblowers in his State of the Nation address on the 9th of February this year. Although the stories of whistleblowers are well documented, they still have no effective protection and support, and they remain in a precarious and vulnerable position. Assassinations, as well as government and public indifference, are among their main concerns. The media have also been ineffective and bad experiences for whistleblowers. Although the whistleblower protection was initially framed in terms of protecting freedom of expression and as a human right, the whistleblower laws that emerged are instead the result of an anti-corruption agenda and not a human rights one. South Africa is slowly picking up the pieces after the damage to many of its public institutions. Several culprits have been charged, and some have already been jailed on the basis of information and evidence presented in court cases. A genuine turnaround is evident, for example, in the recent announcement by the South African Revenue Service, which was one of the casualties of state capture. Its tax revenue collection outcome for 2022 was 1.564 trillion, which is evidence that it is once again fully functional to support South Africa's development objectives. It has recommitted itself to serve the higher purpose of enabling government to build a capable state and to strengthen the foundations of South Africa's democracy. The improvement to this and other key institutions are crucial in a country still burdened by huge inequalities. And it is in no small measure due to the bravery of whistleblowers like Athol and others. Together with other nameless information heroes, their commitment to integrity in their duties and their selfless sacrifices to serve a higher purpose deserve full appreciation. They bring to the discipline of information science other ways of thinking about and understandings about information in a so-called post-truth world, in which eye-catching and rating-raising headlines appear to matter more. How we talk and write about information should connect our discipline with the communities in which we live. I have learned from Johannes Smithson, Patrick Mallet, Athol Williams, and Jacobus de Choi that there are other ways of thinking, talking, and writing about information. These are perhaps more mundane ways connected with values and ideas about what is right and what is wrong, and whether or how these change with time and place. Athol discovered that Bain and Company revealed to him only the information it wanted to reveal, instead of the information he needed for the task it had assigned to him. He calls this Bain truth, in the sense of only revealing information if and when asked, or of invoking legal privilege not to reveal information. Athol describes this as labeling information to protect corrupt interests. In that way, Bain and Company used the labels commercially confidential and non-public information to hide information about tampering with the tender process at South Africa's telecommunications company, Telkom, that won them a contract and 1 billion rand in fees. Bain truth was not the truth to which Athol had committed himself. And Bain information was instead about showing mistakes that it had made, but not that it had done anything morally wrong or caused any injustice. It was in fact vain disinformation instead of vain misinformation. Athol, however, committed himself to sharing the information about Bain and Company with South Africa's Commission of Inquiry, as well as with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. We need more information heroes to stand up to information bullies and scoundrels. These aspects of information and of information science deserve closer and fuller scrutiny. Thank you.
Hema, you are muted.
Thank you, Professor Archie, for your enlightening talk. It's now open for questions. You can put your questions in the chat, or if you would rather speak up, then that's fine too. Yes, Imain? Do you have anything? Yeah, I thought you were, sorry. All right, there is one question.
Yes, thank you, Hema. I have a question.
Okay, please. Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Professor Archie.
Okay.
For this interesting presentation and the inspiring stories shared. That's a comment from Imain. Thank you, Imain.
I have also a question.
Sure.
Can I?
Yeah, please. Please.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Professor Archie, for your interesting presentation. And I really want to know how we can add these stories of heroes in our current curriculums, so that we can inspire the youth of today's to be more engaged in our real life. As you know, now our youth engage in social media, in virtual reality, and so on, and that's not really making the real life in Earth productive. So, what do you think about how to inspire them by these true stories? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. What I have been doing, and also it's nice to see Dr. Danny there. Welcome, Dr. Danny.
Yeah. Yes, hi, hi, Professor.
Yeah, but yes, Iman, what I do, I teach a class in information science, and I have some young students there. And what I try to do to convey the kinds of things I've been talking about is to invite them to find similar articles, ranging from very scholarly articles in what we always like to think of as being refereed in double blind and in good journals, but also to look in more popular journals or business journals or the popular media where they pick up stories like this. And then bring it to class. Then we discuss it together, and we are able then to connect some of these stories with more, let's say, discipline-related concepts about information, and some of the laws and acts about freedom of access to information and so on. And in that way, my hopes are that the young generation will go on to think a little bit more about not just, we have to concentrate on the new technologies. And of course, that is all in our program and our syllabus as well. But to help them when they go out there and they work as information professionals, that they are also aware of, some of the other aspects of information that are important and that have sometimes direct implications for their careers and their lives to growing up as citizens of the country, as well as larger issues which affect the region where we stay in Africa, as well as the world at large. So those are some of the things, and I learn from them. They then tell me what they found, and that that process of sharing helps me to think more carefully about it and write about it. And talk about it, which I have the privilege to do sometimes. So that is one way in which I've been successful in making them more conscious about things like information being important to whistleblowing and being important to heritage and important to many other things, sort of outside of the normal scope of topics and subjects in our information science discipline and courses.
Yeah, and I would also think that if there is a curriculum, a model curriculum that everybody can use, at least highlighting the points in African universities, plus also outside, that would be a nice thing to include in our programs, educational programs of the information science. There is another question here by Ken Herald. Our memory organizations are traditionally considered to be passive recorders of events and actions as history. Your talk inspired us to focus on charismatic and active memory producers, actual people flourishing and sustaining each other now and each moment. Can we teach this? How do we teach this? How do we impart this?
Well, first, that's a very gracious comment by Ken Harold, whose work I've read, and I'm a great fan, admirer. But to move on to what I think is, as I've talked about this museum in Cape Town, which is now accessible to the public, has a strong focus on the youth. And the idea is for them to come and come into the museum in Cape Town, but also to access the museum online. And what we find there is a way of then in some way liaising or talking to or connecting themselves to people, as Ken has mentioned, who in the past have been, either overlooked or their ideas have been put to one side, especially in our the history of our country, and now can retrieve that and get a wider appreciation, a wider understanding, and therefore more sympathetic understanding of our own place in this part of the world. For example, South Africa has always been a very closed place and not considered to be part of Southern Africa or Africa. That has changed a lot, and I think the Camissa Museum even helps and connects with young people because of its very high-tech outlook and the way it sees itself trying to reach out to young people and to share the information which has been hidden from us in the past in a way which pulls them in. So there are many, for example, that museum also does heritage tours in the Cape by taking young people out and so on. So I think there are many ways, and I don't know, maybe some of my own colleagues like Iman or even Daniel, who are on the African continent, can share ideas about how we can all learn from each other to improve this with a focus on young people.
Thank you, Archie. Daniel has a question. Yes, Daniel.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you so very much. Wonderful to see you, Professor Archie. Just for the background, I was serving as Fulbright scholar at Pretoria University, and I had the privilege of kind of having a wonderful conversation with Professor Archie. So this is wonderful to see this presentation, to share with others. You discussed about the information heroes of 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. To me and for most of us, I think you are one of the modern era information heroes, really. As Ima really mentioned, with the current technology oriented lifestyle in general, knowing South Africa as a society, I think your own household is a kind of a glimpse hope for future of South Africa, how black and white interact, your own children, your own grandchildren, your family, your friends, with that level of intimacy, with that level of trust, with that level of, so, how do you see the future of South Africa, that beautiful country, considering that's the last frontier of good and bad, considering what happened, as humanity, how do you see the future, and what's the role of, information, considering the social media era, the misinformation, the whole thing globally we share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Daniel. And as you've mentioned, it was wonderful to have you here in our department. I think many of our young colleagues have benefited by your being here, and sometimes I think even sharing presentations, co-presenting with them. I can just feel the legacy you have left behind you from being here. But you are right. Generally, I am very hopeful about our country. Especially as you probably have seen by being on our university campus, you probably have seen a very different South Africa from which I grew up in. So this campus is now one which reflects the different peoples of South Africa, different cultures, and I believe that is a sign of where we're moving to. But as we move forward, it is with teething problems, it is with challenges which we have to face, like many other, I think, countries in Africa are facing or have faced, as well as countries in other parts of the world, especially in developed countries, developing countries. So I think the role of information is crucial, and what that means is it makes our work as educators, and probably as a little more senior in terms of our own experience and in knowing the history of our own country, taking this forward, it's very important to be able to show to our students who themselves will go out eventually and show them the value of information in presenting the truth about our past, and in sort of making peace with that. And that is why I refer to our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was one of them. I think the best things for me to experience in my lifetime, when we had former perpetrators, of crimes, meeting with the victims of those same crimes, and sometimes even embracing each other with a view to moving forward. Of course, some people think it was a little controversial and was sometimes a bit of a showpiece. But if we look back at it, it has brought many of us together in ways that we don't think would have been possible otherwise. And because we had television and because we had information, being shared in different ways than it used to be, the nation as a whole felt those emotions. When we saw Nelson Mandela being released from Robben Island, we had television, so we could see him whether we were in Cape Town in the south or in Pretoria in the north, or even further away from what happened, those events. But so that's just one example of how information can be used, to mend broken, dreams and try and deal with the hurt and the pain of the past, as well as then using information to keep us aware of what's happening in the country. And that is why we are still recovering now again, in a sense, from what we called state capture, when so much of our public institutions, which deliver basic services, things like just things like safety and security. So our police force was captured. Things like communication. So our telecom, which was the big utility for communication, was captured. In other words, money was stolen from it. And so our health, and so I can go on. So we are moving, fortunately, because of the commissions of inquiry now, we have pinpointed the problems and moving on. But I think it's about information and being made accessible to everyone in all languages. We have 11 languages in our country, and probably more than that as well. So information is very important, Dr. Danny, and I thank you for that question.
Thank you, Archie. I
Thank
have
you.
a question from Email. Thank you again for this inspiring facts. Do you think that your study can be generalized for all Africa heroes?
Well, you know, I would like to think that we do have points of connection, since we share the same continent, and we share the same. Many of our countries share the same history of colonialism, and having moved through this kind of you know, burden, some of us have come out of it in different ways. In our case, we are still struggling, and in many of our neighboring countries, we are still struggling. But there are certain commonalities, you know, and that is why we have, you know, some organizations which try to pull countries in Africa together. And whether it works or not, I'm not sure. But I always think that at the most basic levels, where we can make a difference in terms of you know, reaching out or starting more federal type organizations. For example, we know that in the librarianship field, there's a group called AFLIA. I don't know if you heard about that. It's the African Federation of Library and Information Associations. And it takes all the library associations and of course some of the information aspect of the information community, and they have meetings and conferences and they share things. So I think, yes, I'm hopeful. I was active in the origination or the foundation of this body many years ago, and I think they're doing good work to bring us together. And we have in our, just like Dr. Danny was here last year, we have now a visiting scholar from Nigeria. She was, in fact, one of my ex-students, and she's with us here. And so, in that way, I think, yeah, we can make a difference on the continent.
Thank you, Archie. She has a second part of the question here. Do you think the current evolution of AI can be helpful, artificial intelligence?
Well, they I have to defer to my friends like Dr. Danny and the others who who know a little bit more about the technology. But I certainly think, and I certainly hope, that this will be the challenge for our younger students and our researchers. To actually see what possibilities, what potential there is. To apply AI technologies. In our department, I have many of my young colleagues, who have a great belief in and commitment to artificial intelligence technologies, and certainly, just as before, we've used technologies as they have come and applied them, and with the idea really of using their benefits to improve quality of life, to improve things that we are struggling with. And if that is possible, I'm all for it.
Thank you. There is a comment from Anika Mayer. She says, "Wonderful and inspiring presentation. Thank you, Professor Archie."
Thank you very much. And if I can take this opportunity while we also all here, this would not have happened today if it wasn't for Anika Mayer. She's another champion in my life, because she was able to put these things together so quickly, the technology, that I was able to share my presentation with you. So thank you to Anika for that.
And Daniel has got a comment. Maybe you want to talk about it, Daniel? Your recent comment?
I think it's the same thing. Just I was typing it before I comment, so it's like exactly the same. So just want to thank and just appreciate Prof. Archie. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We have another 4 minutes. I have a question about this Tamil language remedies that you were talking about. It's intriguing. I would like to know, how did the Tamil language medical remedies end up in a notebook of a Dutch-speaking person, of a Dutch-speaking slave?
Thank you very much, Emma. Just to make it brief, we know from archival records kept by the Dutch East India Company itself that there were Tamil-speaking slaves in the Cape Slave Lodge. But the source of these medical remedies was more likely a Sri Lankan who was an exile to the Cape for something that happened in it was called Ceylon then, and he was exiled to the Cape. His name was Nicholas Ondaiki, and we have proof from his own letters that his family actually sent him 2 books with medical remedies, as well as poles and roots. And he was also acquainted with Johannes's relatives. We can't prove exactly, but we think that because of this connections between him and because he had this great knowledge about medical remedies when he was here in exile at the Cape, he was able to write it either himself into the book or the Sri Lankan slaves in the slave lodge wrote it on his behalf. We're not certain because there are 2 lines of the remedies which are repeated. So it could have been a copyist who did that on behalf of Nicholas Ondaiki, who was from Sri Lanka.
And in your talk, you mentioned about the Siddha medicine. You said that it's part of the Tamil Siddha medicine. Is it still practiced in any form in Africa, that system of medicine?
As far as I know, we do have, besides our traditional modern scientific based medicine, we do have in many parts of the country, we have traditional medicine still practiced, and they make use of, of roots and other things that one finds in our natural environment. But these are today seen as, more sort of traditional kind of medicine, which probably lives alongside, mainstream medicine, and especially in rural parts of the country where you don't have access to doctors and access to medicines. But it is not as widely known or practiced unless you travel there or you have a very strong interest as a researcher or a scientist to find out more about that.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Thank you so much, Professor Archie, for such an informative and enlightening talk, really. And you took us through a journey of history of South Africa, along with highlighting the 3 heroes from the past and the present. And you've left us with a lot of things to think about, and in terms of how to integrate some of these historical actual facts into our curriculum, so that the legacy is sort of is available to younger folks. So thank you so much, really, and thank you everybody for such an active participation and your questions, and for being here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we close